Welcome, my friends, to Inside the Minds of Authors. I'm DC Gomez, and I'm thrilled you're joining me today for a fun conversation with a passionate author. We're kicking off the program, like it's our tradition, with a short reading from the feature book. I hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get started.
My name is Michael Zucker. I'm a historical fiction author. The book that I'm presenting today is historical fiction with a little bit of science fiction built in. It's titled Liopleurodon, the Master of the Deep. Liopleurodon was a very large sea carnivore in the Jurassic, and in this novel, it returns in the early 20th century, and former President Theodore Roosevelt believes that if he can destroy it, then the Kaiser's Germany will not be able to capture and weaponize it. And so that kind of is the main conflict and plotline in the novel. The sample that I chose to read is the first American attempt to try to destroy the Liopleurodon. And I'll just give a little context before I get into it. So what the United States Navy has decided to do is they've taken 3 ships. One is a destroyer, the 2 patrol boats, and they've placed gasoline and chum over a field within the Atlantic Ocean. The chum meant to draw the Liopleurodon's interest, and then the gasoline is obviously flammable. And so they have just shot the field with a flare, which ignited it, and the Liopleurodon, as intended, was scared and went toward the patrol boats, which are smaller than the destroyer. And the sailors have both rifles and harpoon guns that are laced with exhalia, which is a toxin that's dangerous for reptiles. So the 2 patrol boats, one is the sea otter, that's where our perspective is in the scene. The other is the moosehead. And the 4 characters to keep track of are Theodore Roosevelt, Luke Jones, who's a student who's interested in this animal, his professor, Will Harris, and the Marine holding the rifle, Sergeant Curtis. And so with that, I will read the sample. He ran to the port side, standing beside Roosevelt. The Liopleurodon's black head, green eyes, and the first red stripe at the base of his neck were visible as he looked to determine if he had damaged the moosehead. Several patches of his skin were raw from the fire minutes before. The pliosaur bled from a gash on the right side of his head where he had struck the vessel. The Liopleurodon hissed and studied his enemies. He could smell and see the small mammals on these metal objects. Luke couldn't take his eyes off the monster. He watched the black slit in its eye vanish and return as it blinked. Luke and the Liopleurodon had never been so close since the reptile awoke from suspended animation. Pop, pop. Rifles discharged as sailors from both vessels fired multiple shots. Most shells threw water into the air around the Liopleurodon's head. A harpoon sliced the edge of its snout, placing the toxin within its bloodstream for a moment before maintaining its momentum into the deep. Curtis, his Springfield loaded, pointed his rifle but feared missing and froze. Roosevelt turned to him. "Do it, Sergeant," Roosevelt ordered. "Do it now." Curtis fired, but so did a rifle from the moosehead. One of the rounds struck the Liopleurodon's head, blowing away skin and skull and bone, but not coming close to causing a mortal injury. The Liopleurodon hissed and submerged. "Blast," Roosevelt said. He turned to Curtis. "You can't be timid in battle." "I'm sorry, Colonel." "Did your round strike him?" Curtis sighed. "Couldn't say." "It's all right," Roosevelt muttered. "I sense this isn't over." He turned to the lieutenant standing on the bridge. "How many harpoons hit their mark?" he shouted. The lieutenant took a moment to respond. "A couple from what I saw." "Mine hit it, I think," one sailor said. "Must do better," Roosevelt whispered to himself. He saw 2 sailors carrying Springfields lower their guns. "Get ready." They raised them. Several sailors reorganized their positions on the Sea Otter's port side, colliding and bumping into each other as they all moved at once. Luke did his best not to walk into anyone. His emotions were in somersaults, as happened several times a day for most of his life. They went from high to low, from excitement to his default dread, and back again. His mind's eye pictured the Liopleurodon lunging at the sea otter and plucking Luke off the boat, dragging him into the depths below. Luke felt claustrophobic, had trouble breathing, and was tempted to step toward the middle of the deck, where there were less people, but did not want to appear unmanly to Roosevelt and Harris. His professor turned to him. "Are you okay? You look pale." Luke nodded. "Maybe you should sit." "I'm fine," Luke said. "Rifleman, eyes on me," the lieutenant shouted. "I want one of you on each flank. The Liopleurodon could attack from either side if he thinks it's undefended." "Retract that order, Lieutenant," Roosevelt said. "Why? He who defends everywhere defends nowhere." "But, Colonel, he's bound to learn that the ship is a platform and we're the real target. Keep your men in place." The lieutenant swallowed his anger. "Do as he says." The riflemen reloaded their guns and pointed them to the water. Sergeant Curtis followed suit. Luke's hands became fists. He anticipated that the next attack would be on the sea otter. It wasn't. It happened faster than Luke could blink. The Liopleurodon pierced the ocean surface, lunging toward the moosehead's deck, his jaws extended, his fangs rubbing against each other, his explosive power causing a shockwave of sound as he launched a direct attack on the moosehead's crew. The sound increased, mushrooming further as multiple rifles and harpoon guns went off at once from both boats. The noise increased a third time as the screams of desperate men merged with the Liopleurodon's roar and metallic clangs to form a single, cohesive, audible wall that not only represented the action but became it in the minds of all present. The Liopleurodon struck the moosehead, shaking it like an elevated punching bag. The noise from the other vessel dissipated as the Liopleurodon submerged once more. There was a flurry of activity after the Liopleurodon's second attack. The moosehead's crew did a body count, while Roosevelt, Wood, and others turned to Curtis. "Well?" Roosevelt asked. Curtis's eyes widened. He looked at Roosevelt, then his Springfield, and then back to Roosevelt. He nodded. "What do you mean? Did you shoot?" Curtis nodded more aggressively. Many of the sailors around them cheered. "How many?" Curtis checked his magazine. "Got off 2 more rounds." "Did you hit it?" Roosevelt asked. "Can't say," Curtis said. He sighed. "Didn't see where they went." "You don't have a clue?" "Not one."
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Inside the Minds of Authors. We have a super excited show for you today. Welcome to an amazing new season, new authors, new exciting adventures. If you haven't signed up for following in any of podcast subscribers, go ahead and do so you don't miss when new episodes are coming. We're going to be doing broadcast episodes on Monday evening, so you don't want to miss it. And if you're interested in supporting the podcast, remember the link for the Patreon account just for the podcast is available on the comments. Check it out. You can actually get an opportunity to see the live recording of the episodes without being edited. So you do not want to miss out. Let's jump in. Hi, Michael. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I am excited to have you. Welcome to the show. I am thrilled you're here. So let's jump in. What is this book about? Give us the insight. Where did it come from? What made you decide to start doing this?
All right. Well, just to start, thank you for having me. So this book is titled Liopleurodon, the Master of the Deep. That sounds like a very science fiction-y type of book, and that is certainly an element, but it is also historical fiction. So the basic premise is that Liopleurodon, which is a large carnivorous sea reptile from the Jurassic period, was preserved by kind of a fluke ice age that did actually happen in that period. And in this novel, it returns in the early 20th century in the year 1911, so a few years before the First World War breaks out. And former President Theodore Roosevelt predicts that the Kaiser's Germany is going to try to capture and weaponize it. Once it's freed into the ocean through mysterious circumstances, he predicts that the Kaiser is going to try to turn it into a weapon against the United States and Great Britain. And he convinces former President Taft to authorize a mission to go after it. And so that race between the Americans and the Germans, the Americans who are trying to destroy it and neutralize it, and the Germans who actually are trying to capture it to use for sort of Atlantic submarine warfare, is kind of the core conflict. And then another wrinkle is that a group of paleontologists are asked by the United States Navy to accompany the mission to help give advice, and they have all types of drama of their own going on. There's a professional rivalry, there's a love triangle, there's all types of sort of character interaction and relationships playing out there. So it's an ensemble cast. On the American side, there's Theodore Roosevelt, President Taft, the Navy captain, people like that, and then the 5 paleontologists. The main character is probably a college-age student who has kind of the deepest backstory of any of the characters and probably the most complicated character arc. And he has sort of an obsession with the Liopleurodon for reasons that are kind of played out throughout the novel.
Super interesting. All these dynamics coming up. I need to know, where did this idea come from? What made you decide to do historical fiction with a touch of science fiction all into one book?
So it's sort of a blend of just different interests that I've had just throughout my life. So when I was 7, I watched the documentary Walking with Dinosaurs, which, like most people, I probably introduced the animal Liopleurodon to probably an entire generation of kids. And that really caught my attention, the way they portrayed it. So that was kind of a childhood interest. And that kind of culminated when I was 14. I wrote a novel where the Liopleurodon returns more into the present day, which at the time was 2009. And that was the first book that I wrote. And then as an adult, when I sort of relaunched my author career, I had an interest in sort of rewriting that novel into a more mature format. And I thought it would be interesting to put it further back in time so it was more difficult for the United States Navy to engage with it. The weaponry was more primitive and older. And the early 20th century, kind of that pre-World War I era, seemed interesting, both because it gives you, a dynamic with the Kaiser's Germany, which a lot of these type of stories seem to be set in World War II. So this would be a bit different. So it's not the Nazis this time. And then also it would allow me to bring in Theodore Roosevelt, who is one of my favorite historical figures. He's a kind of a crazy character, as a lot of historians and history buffs know. And so I think just bringing all of that together seems like a story with good potential.
I'm glad you had a blast writing this. And I'm glad you actually brought all these different pieces into the mix that make you smile. Like, hey, I like these things. I'm going to add these pieces into it. So I think it's super exciting. Were you thinking of doing a series out of this, or is this just a standalone book? What was your take on this?
This is primarily a standalone novel. I think the kind of climax of it, even just kind of the entire second half, kind of makes clear why this is a standalone novel. I don't want to go into like kind of spoiler territory, but I think that was my intention going into it, which in a way is freeing because it's like you don't have to keep all of the pieces on the board in order to like kind of maintain sequels. Although I do think if the reception is strong enough, there is still the potential to do a sequel. It just would have to go in a different direction. But yeah, I was more interested in doing a standalone, I think, for the first few novels that I'm working on as an adult. Just it takes so much concentration that like once you're kind of done with it, at least for me, it feels like, okay, I don't want to think about this topic or these characters again for a while.
I need a rest from these people because they're in my head for so long. You do a lot of historical fiction. What motivates you to stay in this genre instead of just jumping completely out of it?
Well, so I had an interest just in fiction and storytelling as pretty much my entire life. I mean, I was writing quote books about dinosaurs when I was like 7. I use quote and just the word pretty liberally. They were kind of like these little stories about like 5 pages long that would have like a few sentences each and a drawing, and I would kind of staple them together. And it's like, look, I wrote a book. So storytelling has been a long-term interest. And then I developed a very strong interest in history when I was around 15 or so. So those two interests kind of just naturally joined together.
I like that you're pulling for the things that you enjoy and bringing them together. So that's always very, very exciting. What was one lesson you learned as an adult when you started writing that you were very surprised about?
I think one thing that I didn't fully appreciate until I was an adult, as opposed to when I was a teenager writing, is, and this might sound maybe obvious to the adult audience, is the importance of the language itself and not just the story that you're conveying through it. So I think now as an adult, I put a lot more thought into like, how exactly do I want to word, each sentence and structure each paragraph. It's not just kind of like random or thrown onto the page or something. Like it needs to be deliberate, and you need to put as much thought into that as into the characters and story and everything like that.
You're becoming a lot more methodical through your process and seeing all these pieces, which is always very exciting. Do you have a writer that has motivated you into your process that you can say, "Oh, I would like to meet them. I would like to be part of this"? Anybody?
I think I draw inspiration from a lot of people. As far as novelists go, I mean, the first really major one that kind of influenced me in this direction with like Liopleurodon and that type of sea adventure was Steve Alton, who wrote the Meg series, which is about large sharks that return to the modern era. And then after that, I mean, different writers in different ways. I mean, as far as historical fiction goes, my favorite is probably Maggie O'Farrell, who wrote the novel Hamnet and The Marriage Portrait, which are two of my favorite historical fiction novels and biographical novels because they're about real people. And then also Ernest Hemingway, which is kind of a classic choice. I think his prose style is very interesting and engaging, at least to me, especially like his use of the word and allows for kind of a nice flow within sentences instead of using commas or just breaking up into separate sentences that you can use and to kind of build different ideas kind of culminating throughout a sentence. I find interesting. And then the last one that I'll cite is Elmore Leonard, a crime novelist who, like me, I think uses dialogue as his primary vessel of storytelling. So I think there's lessons for me to learn there and that I've drawn influence from, and also kind of playing with sentence structure, which I'm doing a lot in the current novel that I'm working on, which the intentional use of incomplete sentences at times in order to sort of make it run smoother and less clunky in a way that if you know what the subject is from the previous sentence or statement, you don't need to repeat it in every single sentence. And so that allows the reading to run a bit smoother. So I think those are some of the major writers that I've been drawing inspiration from lately.
It's fun that you can learn from other people's styles as well as mistakes and lessons that they have given it, because it's always a great practice and it saves you a lot of time. That way you're not having to learn these mistakes yourself and trying to do them. You mentioned you have working on a new book. Can you tell us about it? What is this book all about?
Sure. So this is more of a straight historical fiction novel. So it's about John Quincy Adams in his time as Secretary of State. Adams is usually ranked by historians as the single greatest Secretary of State in American history. And the major plot line is it deals with the collapse of the Spanish Empire, which had been built starting with Columbus and then throughout the 1500s, built by the destruction of the native population of the Western Hemisphere. And so now in the early 1800s, after the Napoleonic Wars, that empire is collapsing. The United States, which is about a generation old, said it has the potential to take advantage of this and kind of rise from like a itty bitty new country into more like a medium-sized country in the world. And so Adams, as the Secretary of State to President Monroe, is trying to take advantage of this. And he thinks that if he can accomplish this and set the United States as the most powerful country in this hemisphere, that the country will elect him the next president. And his parents, I mean, he's the oldest son of John and Abigail Adams. You can imagine the type of pressure he's under to succeed and to become president. That's sort of the drive of that novel. But then it gets more complicated that once it looks like he succeeded, an alliance of countries in Europe, led by Austrian diplomat named Prince Metternich, challenges the independence of South America, which leads to a sort of chess match type of showdown between Adams and Metternich for the independence of the Western Hemisphere.
Ooh, how much research do you have to do for your books? Because this is very intense and you have all these pieces come into this.
Well, for the Adams book, I have over 300 pages of research that was built on. The Liopleurodon book was a little more complicated because, I mean, on the one hand, I had the previous version of that novel kind of just kind of had to re-engage my memory in terms of what that animal is like and some of the pieces there. I'd also already read fairly extensively about Theodore Roosevelt, so just kind of like reviewing some of those sources and learning a bit about the state of paleontology and the American and German navies in that period. So that one, at the time, it felt like a lot of research, but after this Adams book, it's like, oh, that was not that bad.
That was easy compared to this one. I'm glad as you continue to develop and grow in your writing, you're adding more and more challenges to yourself. Will you consider writing in a different genre?
Yes, I think right now I want to focus on historical fiction for the next few years. I think partly it's because like each audience kind of exists within a genre is kind of what I'm gathering as I've launched my kind of adult author career. And so it would really be like starting from scratch to kind of move to a different genre between books that quickly. I do have certain science fiction ideas I think would be interesting to work on in the future, and maybe can kind of build historical fiction into it again, like I did with the Liopleurodon book. But that's sort of an idea for down the line that I kind of want to kind of continue building place within the historical fiction community for now.
As you continue to grow your books and your process and your brand, what is one thing you would love for your readers to take away from your books?
Well, I think I'm trying to target topics like John Quincy Adams or one of my other novels deals with Dwight Eisenhower, topics that have not been overly analyzed within the public mind. So both the ability to learn history that not everybody is as familiar with as, say, like the Civil War or the American founding or something like that, that there's both that opportunity, but also to kind of look at some of the character kind of analysis and psychology there that I think is one of the main things that I try to concentrate on. So whether it's the student character within the Liopleurodon novel or John Quincy Adams in his novel, that there's characters that you can relate to and kind of maybe see part of yourself within them. I think those are some of the major facets that I would hope readers take away from the novels.
Ooh, that's exciting. And for our listeners, you can actually get into these books, understand them, connect them, and learn a little bit more about yourself. So I love it. Tell us, dear, where can our listeners find you when they can learn more about the books? Where are you located in social media? Tell us.
So I'm most active on Twitter, where I have two accounts. One is very Eisenhower themed. It's called Ike's Biggest Fan. That is at Michael Zucker 1. And then the other one is titled MB Zucker Books, which I believe is at MB Zucker Books. One other thing that I would like to mention is that Lyle Plord on the Master of the Deep also has an Audible version. So if you'd like professional to read it and it will sound better than how I just read the passage, that exists on Audible, and the books can be found on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and I think most other places that books can be found online.
Nice. So, to our listeners, you get options of where you can find these books, where you can enjoy it, have a blast with this story. And, dear, before you leave us, are you ready for the lightning round?
Sure. Yeah.
Easy peasy. Don't think too much about it. Let's see how you do. Cold drinks or hot?
Cold.
Nice. Wizard or knight?
Night.
Awesome. Comedy or action?
Action.
You have to think about that one. Okay. Here's a little different. Let's see how this one plays out. If you could have any superpower, what would you pick?
This might sound stereotypical for a historical fiction author, but time travel.
I love it. Do you have a period that you would like to visit?
I have people that I would like to visit. The first one is probably Eisenhower, given that I've declared myself his biggest fan. I think that would be fair.
Only fair to say. I totally agree with you. Thea, do you have any closing remarks for us?
I hope everybody's having a good start to their year. And if you enjoy historical fiction, I think that these works would be have a unique place in the genre and would be accessible to anybody interested in the topics.
Ooh, I love it. To our listeners, go ahead, pick up the books, check it out. Follow Mr. Michael on Twitter. If you're a Twitter fan, make sure you check him out. If you are new to the podcast, make sure you go ahead and subscribe. You don't want to miss anything. Thank you so much, dear, for joining us. It has been a pleasure. To our listeners, thank you for joining us again. We'll be back next Monday with another exciting author. So we'll see you guys then. And remember, If you're interested in supporting the podcast, click on the link and join the Patreon community. Bye, everyone.